The United States is again weaponizing one of the most powerful assets in the global economy, access to the dollar. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has warned countries and financial institutions dealing with Iran that they risk being pushed out of the dollar-based financial system. The idea is to outcast countries that continue doing business with Tehran. And this matters because the dollar is not simply another currency. It sits at the center of the global financial system. Think of global trade as a massive network of banks. When a company in India pays a supplier in another country in dollars, the transaction usually involves corresponding banks. Banks that hold accounts with one another and help move money across borders. SWIFT sits in the middle of much of this process, but there is an important distinction. SWIFT does not actually move the money. It is essentially a secure messaging system that tells banks who is paying whom, how much, and where the money should go. The actual settlement of dollar transactions can happen through U.S. financial infrastructure such as CHIPS, the major private sector dollar clearing system, or Fedwire, the Federal Reserve's payment system. And because so much international trade and finance is conducted in dollars, access to this infrastructure becomes enormously valuable. That is also what gives Washington leverage. The United States does not necessarily have to sanction every company trading with Iran directly. It can tell a foreign bank, do business with Iran and risk losing access to the U.S. financial system. For a bank, that can be an extremely difficult choice. Iran may be an important trading partner, but access to dollar transactions, corresponding banks, and the U.S. financial system is far more valuable to many global banks. This is why the threat can have a multiplier effect. But there is another side to the story. The more the dollar system is used as a geopolitical weapon, the greater the incentive for countries to build alternatives. China has developed its cross-border interbank payment system to facilitate the yuan-denominated international payments. Russia has its own SPFS financial messaging system developed after earlier Western sanctions. And countries such as China, Russia, and Iran have increasingly explored bilateral trade in local currencies, currency swaps, alternative payment channels, and even digital assets. But these systems are not yet a complete replacement for the dollar network. Dollar still accounts for roughly 57% of global exchange reserves, though the number has fallen considerably over the past 2 decades. So the bigger question is not whether the dollar can be replaced overnight. It cannot. The question is whether repeated use of financial sanctions gradually encourages countries to build a parallel system that could eventually fragment global finance into competing payment networks, one centered on the dollar and others built around the yuan, local currencies, and alternative infrastructure. Washington may be trying to cut Tehran off from the dollar, but every time the dollar system is used as a geopolitical weapon, the rest of the world gets another incentive to build a financial system that depends on it a little less. Klinsmann Murati is an economist and founder of Pareto Economics, is now joining us live from London. Welcome to the broadcast, Mr. Murati. I just want to know from you, what do you make of the Treasury Secretary's statement of isolating Iran economically? Will it work?
Look, this is just the same song sang through different, people. For the longest time, Iran has been the subject of US sanctions, initially due to their perceived nuclear program. And after the JCPOA was agreed, when Trump came into office the first time, he then heavily sanctioned Iran again and got rid of that. So the point is, does this move by Trump encourage different financial engineering to happen and infrastructure to be built? Yes, but very slowly. The biggest alternatives to SWIFT, as you mentioned already, have been Chinese and Russian, right? The majority of people who trade with these entities will use these systems in place. So there will not be a big incentive to create your own system because the other centers of power have already done so. This may just slow down business and frustrate business, but it's certainly nothing new to the international business and trade community, because these sanctions on Iran and this sort of bullying by the Trump administration is done as a response to their lack of progress with their conflict with the Iranians.
Mr. Murati, the dollar's share of global reserves has fallen significantly over the past 2 decades. How much of that decline should concern the United States?
Well, look, that's a very big question to ask. But yes, over the last 30 years or so, it has gone down. But at the same time, what we have to understand is Trump is trying to do two things at the same time, right? He wants to encourage onshoring of manufacturing capacity in the US, which then will mean that US consumers will rely on buying things from the US market as opposed to buying it from foreign markets, right? But at the same time, what he's saying to the world is you need to either pick us or Iran, and because we have the biggest markets, you won't be able to sell into us, which is very contradictory in their statements. I think the US has seen for a long time that, yes, the share of reserves has been falling, right? The fact that Trump and other presidents have used sanctions to gain what they want has moved people to create their own systems. And this is just a natural progression and a natural evolution of power across the years.
Mr. Murati, what happens to global trade if the world moves from one dominant financial system to multiple competing payment networks?
Well, look, that again isn't too much of a big issue, as I mentioned before, because there may be some, I suppose, administrative frustrations, but business will happen regardless, okay? We have systems with SWIFT, which is the biggest one, and minor ones in the US and other parts of the world. And so far, this hasn't frustrated international business as much, right? Because as you mentioned, these are just signaling platforms to tell banks to send money from one to another, right? And as technology evolves and becomes much more efficient, then these changes of platforms won't matter as much. I don't think it's going to have a big impact. What's going to have a bigger impact are the long-term ramifications of the war in Iran, the inflation that we're seeing, and the hiking of interest rates in the future if inflation continues to persist. That, I think, is a much bigger concern to international business than the platforms in which they use to send money abroad.
Klinsman Murati, thank you very much for your time and for talking to us today.
Thank you.